Welcome to Human Services Professionals and Personal Systems. My name is Mitchell Marcus and I'm your professor for this course. This course is also known as HSP 301, but in this course we are going to take an introductory overview of the field of human services, which derived out of the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Over the decades, this department has undertaken many different names. It has had a myriad of responsibilities and ways that it has evolved and shifted, and the areas in which it cares for people has changed. And so we're going to look at that at kind of an overarching 10,000 foot view today. And we're just going to discuss from a personal systems point of view how this affects potential people who are clients for these services or who seek out these services. How do they work together? How does it serve them? And so it's very important to understand it from a personal systems level. So we're going to begin that today. But as we kick off this class and as we get started, I am going to have everybody start with an introduction. So when you get in your group of one, I would love for you to share a name, a fun fact, and what inspired you to explore the field of human services, or what made you interested in a career in human services.
My name is Kara Marcus, and a fun fact for me is I've been to all the states of the United States except for Alaska.
Very exciting.
And what inspired me is I'm a single mom, and I do enjoy helping people, and I feel like human services is kind of a good area to pursue, and just seeing how you can help people in many ways.
Awesome, great. Well, as I said, my name is Mitchell Marcus. I'm your professor. A fun fact about myself is I was almost on an episode of Judge Judy for suing somebody. It was sad it didn't work out. I was excited to meet her. And then what inspired me to explore the field, I just think human services professionals and just the industry as a whole is very fascinating, and as I've said, it has undertaken many different levels and responsibilities, but I think it's really wonderful to have an organization that is dedicated to helping people, and oftentimes it's people who have been through a lot, who have kind of been looked over or looked down upon by society, and so being able to have offices dedicated to supporting them and uplifting them, I think is totally crucial. And I find that very fascinating, and I think there's a lot of great work to be done that is being done, and I think expanding on it is wonderful, and taking it to the next level and continually bettering our society is really, really awesome. So that's what intrigued me to pursue it. Now, a little bit about the background. So as we begin, I kind of want to start with a question. So as we're thinking of the field of human services in the industry, what services and or organizations do you think fall under the umbrella? It's a very large umbrella, and as I said, it's shifted. So what services would you say fall under that?
I would think like a food bank,
Okay.
like homes for like abused women, or domestic violence type situations. I think that's what I can think right now.
Okay. Are there any?
Let's see. Mental health.
Okay, yeah.
That would help people.
Mhm.
So you kind of have like your basics, housing.
Yes.
Housing's another. Housing, mental health, food, things like that, where people need like basic needs.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's great. I think all of those are wonderful examples. So I came up with a list of some of the most common ones. So food stamps and other people experience services to help support people who are experiencing food insecurity, I think is big. This would also include like free and reduced lunch in schools and things like that. Support for homelessness or housing insecurity. This is any kind of shelter. I know you mentioned like women's shelters and other things. All of those would fall under that. Also child services, so child protective services if students or children are just in unsafe situations, if something unfortunate has happened to their family structure, to support them in that. Drug and alcohol support is also a big one, helping people, and oftentimes a lot of these go together, and as you mentioned, mental health support and other health support, physical health support is also another big one. So these are all different areas, and it's not limited to this, there are other nuances and things as well, but these are kind of the big main categories. So As we get started, I said I wanted to give you a little history. So, in 1953, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the HEW, was created under President Eisenhower. And then in 1979, it shifted, and the Department of Education Organization Act actually separated the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. So from 1953 to 1979, they were actually acting as one entity, and that brought in a lot of different roles, a lot of different things. And so a question that I have is, with the shift from separating the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services, are there any benefits, any drawbacks that you can think of in separating those entities?
I can think more of the other way, like if they were to stay combined, they can help one another in like a team base and use their sources together to help. Separate, if, gosh, losing my.
That's okay. I think that's a great example. So just to restate your point, you see one potential drawback as, in separating them, the resources that were once combined in a more centralized location are now not.
Yeah, and when different resources of different services maybe are lacking or whatever, sometimes the other one maybe would be able to step in and help, like, fill in the gaps and the cracks of what's happening in regards to whatever the situation is. Like maybe burnout, things like that, so people could come in and like fill that gap in that.
Exactly.
And so that would be like a better in a team. I'm still trying to think of something that would be like, if it was separate, if the mental health or was so large that maybe combining it might just get too muddy. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. I also actually think in separating them, to your point of burnout, I think burnout within not only the field of health and human services, but also in the field of education is extremely high, higher than a lot of other industries. And so I think actually in separating them, it creates the opportunity for more human capital and thus helping to minimize some of that burnout.
That's true.
I think our educators today are often tasked with many different things, from controlling students' behavior and monitoring that, to not only lesson planning and delivering the material. And so I think actually in separating the Department of Education and Human Services, some of the children's welfare support actually more falls on its own entity, which allows for better care and more attention for students. But to your point, it also decentralizes it, and so it creates much more of an opportunity of a need for collaboration, which requires people to work together, and it requires the right people in positions, and so that's another factor that I do think is important. Another history point from the Department of Health and Human Services is in 1980, federal funding was finally approved for states for foster care and adoption assistance. So that was one of the first times in history where we actually tried to provide incentive for people to help support these children who needed homes and who needed stable places to stay. Some other history as well is sorry, lost my mouse. In more recent history, in 1999, the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act was signed, making it possible for millions of Americans who had disabilities to be able to join the workforce without it affecting their Medicare or Medicaid. And so prior to that point, if they were working, it would actually reduce their benefit. Even though they were unable to work, also oftentimes these benefits are rather small anyway. So in working, it actually created more issues. So now we've been able to minimize that. As well, in 2001, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid were created, offering an actual location for people to get help, as well as the financing administration was implemented. And in 2001, another fun fact is that Department of Health and Human Services responded to the nation's first bioterrorism attack when anthrax was being mailed to people. So this also led to the creation of different committees and things for national crises. I know a more recent crisis was the COVID-19 pandemic in recent years, and so this all kind of stemmed, and what was just helping people who were in need or who had fallen on tough times and were in negative situations has grown to a much more nationally recognized issues in a lot of cases as well. Another important milestone was in 2003, the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act allowed for prescription medication to actually fall under health insurance, which was a huge win for the Department of Health and Human Services, as we often provide resources, medical resources for people who can't afford it for themselves. So that was a huge win. And then one of the more recent ones is in 2010, the Affordable Care Act was signed, putting a comprehensive U.S. health insurance plan that allowed people who didn't qualify for health insurance, whether they didn't get it through work or wherever, to actually be able to have support in purchasing medically necessary services, prescription medication, etc., and having access to that. So that's been really, really huge. So in thinking of this, I've mentioned that obviously there's been a lot of peaks and valleys, shifts, changes, care has changed a lot. So I want to have a discussion, and so I'm going to break y'all into groups. So I want you to think from a potential client's perspective. Oftentimes people utilize more than one of these services, sometimes it's just one, but usually there is several different issues that need to be addressed that can be across multiple offices. So I want you to think of all of the services as we've talked about them and potentially any new ones. How do they work together, as well as what services do you think clients may use the same of? So I will give y'all about 5-ish minutes to discuss. Hello, let's discuss. So, as we think about this, are there any systems or things that you think actually would work? I know we talked about within education and the Health and Human Services Department, those shifts, but what are your thoughts on other services? Are there any that come to mind?
Well, being a single mother and, having to make sure that like your basic needs are met. Food, like you mentioned before, like the food stamps, or people coming out of prison, they need to have like a start. You wanna help people like get a start. You wanna help them, maybe if they needed food stamps, where do you go? If you have a disability, where do you go? If you have, just, like maybe a place to stay. So like in a domestic situation, you might have to have childcare to help you in that. So you might kind of need an umbrella of, you're not gonna, even if you get food stamps from one place, that's not gonna fix the need of maybe having a place to stay, or the potential of just maybe learning a skill, so that you can, be able to get out on your own. You don't want to just keep taking the services, but you also want to do that to be able to, give back or help each other, collaborate with like maybe like a women's shelter. Some people maybe will watch the children, while others will go educate themselves and maybe get a skill set, learn a skill set or something like that.
Yeah, so as you're thinking about this, you've mentioned obviously food and housing may go hand in hand, as well as childcare.
Yeah.
I think that's big. Another one you mentioned was kind of around education and helping support people. Kind of, as the saying goes, if you give a man a fish, they'll eat for a night, but if you teach a man to fish. And so I think that brings in an education piece, which I think there are a lot of overlaps between the Department of Education and Human Services.
Agreed.
I think those are all great. Are there any other ones?
I mean, I think sometimes if you're like, if it was like battered wife or relationships like that coming out of prison, sometimes people have, mental health issues. So to be able to, get maybe some sort of therapy to just kind of help work for that, so that it puts you in a better mindset to be able to, because if you're heavy with life, then you're not necessarily going to be able to go in the workforce when you've kind of been through maybe some form of trauma or something. So that would be beneficial to actually work on yourself to be able to handle all the other life things.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Do you think, how many of these services do you think maybe the same client might utilize?
They could use, I mean, especially like if you were a single person and you didn't have it and you had kids and you came from all of that, you could use them all. I mean, it's not kind of like you almost need a one-stop shop for all so that people can collectively heal themselves and round themselves wholly. I mean, if you just gave somebody housing, that's great, but that might not suffice, then if they don't have a way to make money or they don't have anybody to watch their kids, then they're not gonna be able to, move forward. You're kind of, it's only like servicing one thing.
Sure. So thinking about this in kind of a personal systems point of view, from kind of a client point of view, say you have somebody is experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. They also might be experiencing food insecurity, as you pointed out, and things of that nature. So think of the process of how does one go and get those? How do you get there? How would you go and apply for these services? What do you think that would entail?
Well, I mean, it'd be nice to have.
No, I'm just, aside from being nice, what do you think they would have to do now? If I was that person, where would I have to go if I needed food?
To get your food stamps, or you could go to like a food bank.
Yeah, I could go to a food bank, or I would need to go and apply for food stamps.
Yeah.
And so I'd need to get all of that documentation and do the application for that.
Yeah.
Okay, if I'm also experiencing housing insecurity, then I would need to go and apply for housing or find a homeless shelter or things of that nature.
Correct.
Right? And so that also requires that. If, assuming that I'm experiencing housing insecurity and food insecurity, I may or may not have some form of transportation as well. And so doing that, it creates quite a cumbersome process for people to actually pursue and utilize these services. It's not straightforward.
Right.
So that leads us into our next section. So I have an activity, and so in this we're gonna have a project. So we are gonna come up with our own organization, assuming the funding came through and everything. We were given $1 million grant. Personal capital or people are not a problem, assuming we get all of that figured out, which we'll later discuss the challenges around that, but today we got our wishes. As we've discussed all of these services and how they work together, one thing that you've mentioned is that it's not streamlined, and maybe having a centralized location would be helpful, to which I agree. So we're going to create our own centralized location. So what would these services be that you would put together? I want you to pick 3 of them. If you want to pick 4, I'll give it to you. But how would they work together to best serve clients? And what would you name your service center? So think of it from a client's perspective. How would you create the most streamlined and supportive organization? So I have a worksheet, and we're going to work through that. So, if you 1 moment. So, since we were just a class of 1 today, we're going to work through it together.
Okay.
So. Okay. So, we can either name our organization now, or we can come back to that.
Let's come back to it. But I think I know kinda, I mean,
Okay.
it's probably not, one that wasn't thought of, but I feel like it's always a big need.
Okay.
So what's the areas that it would be?
Yes. What 3 service areas does your organization combine?
It would be like a house.
Okay.
Housing. But, yeah.
Okay.
It could, I need 4 probably.
Okay, that's fine. We can do 4.
So I would say, cause housing to me, and then we have food, I know that would be like another, cause that to me all kind of comes together. but also helping, childcare if need, cause that would be for those that need it. And then also, helping those with, to get back into the workforce of some sort, or education and workforce connections, something like that. I'd also want therapy, but
Well,
I need 6.
okay.
I want 5, okay. Well, because I think altogether, I'm looking as, like, I'm a single mom. And so I'm thinking if life got difficult for me and I had children and I'm trying to like make it, but I wasn't fully educated, and I needed a place to go, or I wasn't able to care for, care for my child at the time. I mean, unless they were like school age, but you just don't know. I would need food, I would need home. Maybe I wasn't, maybe my education, some of those could be for some people and some of those could be not. Like maybe some people don't have kids, so that wouldn't matter, but you sort of need to have an umbrella.
Sure, I agree. Okay, here we go. So specifically, how do these 5 now work together? I mean, I know you've talked about it, but in what ways how do you foresee it working together? Also, how do you foresee kind of the intake process or the application process for a potential client?
Gosh, I was trying to think if I have my $1 million or whatever to be able to do it. I mean, I envision like having like a house, because I think if you have a home for people to go to, you could use parts of the home for people to stay in. You would have your kitchen, you'd have the things so that people would be able to, to feed them, right?
Yep.
And then collectively, hopefully you could have connections within the community, maybe for like a support for jobs or needs, or on the other side, some of the people within the home could be able to help provide some work, support in helping those within the home collectively. Some could be a child care person, somebody could be cooking, somebody could be working around the yard, maybe you have a landscaper, maybe they can help with, out in the yard. I mean, there's like a wide range of, it's because if you think of your own life as a personal person, you need all of your home to work together.
Yes.
And so you're kind of just providing like a pseudo home for people to come together.
Yeah.
And I know I'm talking fast,
No,
but you need a pseudo home for people to come to feel like a home, and them to feel comfortable enough, and be able to, when they're more in a healthy mind, to be able to move forward and pursue work and not worry about like the other needs.
Yeah, I agree. I think also another thing that staff could help with can help work with the school district to help get students enrolled.
Yeah, that's a good. I think together, if you could connect with the community about some of the needs that your potential clientele that are coming into the home need, like you said, childcare, education. If you could have support from the community in that, then you could also give people opportunities to say, there's a food place or this and that where you could go work, if when people come in, just to kind of get them in touch with the back into the workforce, just to even kind of rise up, get to work, be on time, things like that.
Yeah.
Kind of get your feet wet.
trying to summarize what you're saying.
I know. It's like community and the community is kind of, a communal support. Yeah, that's good. Because then you could also help them too. Like if it's a small business, maybe you could send people over to that small business. They can kind of help you and vice versa.
Exactly.
But I think having a home would be like a nice place rather than like a sterile
Agreed.
building or something like that.
So kind of what you're describing would be as a home structure that put a big emphasis on community engagement and community resources, meaning that staff would have partnerships with local school districts and childcare opportunities. For little kids who might not be ready for school, we could have some in-home options, but for those who are school age, we can work with the schools to get them enrolled to help support them, and not only support the client, but support their family. And then also you described kind of a communal kitchen environment, which would allow people to learn how to cook for themselves more so, but also would allow us to hire a smaller kitchen staff to be able to meal prep, ensure that foods are ready and things of that nature, to allow people to do that. Did I miss anything?
Well, I think at the end, like the whole goal of it is that, when you pour into people and you kind of help fill their cup because they're empty, then you're to help teaching them, like you said, we're help teaching them to fish, but then at the same time, then they give back, and then collectively it works. But if you're only pouring and they're just sitting, it doesn't like help them grow. You kind of want to pour into people that way. And add in the mental health if people need any sort of therapies or something at some time, that's good to add. I'm still trying to think of a name.
Okay, that's okay. Well, before we get to the name, are there any areas of conflict that you see that you would foresee in combining these areas for clients? So are there any potential areas that you think
the downside I could see is the ones that are providing, like the providers of the home, could get burned out where they're trying, if the systems in place don't, like if you maybe don't have community support, then it's hard for you to help them move forward if you don't have like connections, you know what I mean? Because people are maybe in a hard place, but they might not have anybody to reach out to themselves, but then you're trying to be, as a provider, trying to give them places to go. If you don't have connections, that's a lot on you to try to like solve all these people's problems and mentally, and that's a lot of challenges where you could get like a bit of burnout on that side. I don't know, people coming in, I mean, it depends on how you vet them and like what is necessary to have a safe environment for kids, because you don't want people coming in that aren't, it's not gonna be a healthy environment if children are in there.
Yeah, I think it's important, but how I think a very important question is just how to operate the overall intake of clients into, especially since it is a more residential environment. It's not as much of a transient environment. And so I think that is definitely a very important distinction that you would need to make at the beginning of the conception of your resource. I think these are great. Okay, have you thought of a name?
I think it's probably been used. I've been thinking like, you want like a positive place, like Hope House or something where people feel like you could come and, something like, I mean, that's all I have is Hope House, but I'm sure there's a Hope House in this world.
Sure, well, you could be Hope House, Tennessee or something.
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
But people feel like, if you don't feel like there's like a positive thing, emphasis on where you're gonna go, like people, don't want it, and you don't want a sterile environment, you want a welcoming environment. And Hope House, I mean, I think people in these types of situations need hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's important. Well, I think this is great. Thank you for that. Okay, we are going to transition back to our slideshow. So, one thing that I think as we were kind of wrapping up this main introduction into the field, I know it was a 10,000 foot overview, but I think you've done a wonderful job of kind of starting to connect the dots of how the resources work together. In some ways they are fractured, and maybe there's pros and maybe there's cons to that. But the one thing is human services is a team sport. As we've identified, obviously the way things stand now, clients, if they are experiencing housing insecurity, they often are experiencing food insecurity. They often might need support in transportation and mental health resources. Everybody needs them. And so having wraparound services is great. That requires a team. It requires a team now because right now I need to go to the food stamp office, I need to go to my shelter, if I need to get my kids in school I have to go register them at the school district, and so it's a lot of moving pieces. So it is a team sport. And then even in your organization that you created for your Hope House in Middle Tennessee, we put a big emphasis on community engagement. And so collaboration is key, collaboration is everything. And you can feed someone. And if you kind of think of it as the big old spider's web, but there's several spider's webs and they're all connected. You can do that, but if it's all intertwined and you only lift up the food, eventually the housing is still kind of weighing them down. And so it needs to be kind of a whole lift for it to stay and for it to stick. If you can lift most of it, the rest should come into place, but if you only treat one of the problems, then there are still others that might need support as well, and thus treatment may or may not be as effective and support may not last.
Yeah.
And so that's really, really important to think of this. So as you explore the field more, as you potentially pursue a career if you so choose, these are important things to think about as you enter in. And as you said, it's important to take care of yourself. This is a field of burnout, and one of the issues that you identified was that your staff at Hope House might get exhausted if they aren't able to support each other and if there's not enough support. And so it's definitely something to think about as you look into this field. So, awesome. Well, thank you for joining me for your class today. Your first assignment is in Canvas. You're going to be figuring out a staffing structure for Hope House. So that's going to be your first assignment.
Okay.
But awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you